So our next session is Alternative Coverage and Open Access Collections in Primo Central, Guidelines and Recommendations. And our two presenters are Zori and Sasek, who is the e-resources and discovery librarian at Metropolitan State University in St. Paul, Minnesota, and a member of the PALS Consortia. There he oversees the life cycle of electronic resources, including their licensing, acquisitions, activation, discovery, management, and evaluation. During the PALS migration to Alma and Primo, he served on both the electronic resource management and discovery functional work groups, both of which provided numerous configuration and policy recommendations to the larger consortia. And Lacey Mamek has been the electronic resources and instruction librarian at Normandale Community College in Minnesota since 2013. Before that, he spent 10 years as a paraprofessional with the government, academic, and public libraries. He serves on two MnPALS, consortia migration work groups, the Alma Focused Electronic Resources Management Work Group, and the Primo V Focused Discovery Work Group. So with that, let's turn it over.
All right. I'm going to share my screen. And can people see that?
Yes.
Okay. I'm Lacey Mamek, and I'm going to be presenting with Zorian, and we'll talk specifically about alternative coverage and open access collections and how to manage those in Primo Central at the library level and at the consortium level, and what the recommendations were that we made for our consortium. We'll talk about what those principles were for us as a group and how we came to that. And then at the end, I threw in another slide, just all the things that I wish other people had told me before I migrated, not necessarily related to our topic, but just I know I have an audience here, and I figured we'd give you some tips, and then we'll have our Q&A. That's a picture of me at the top and Zorian at the bottom, and because neither of us have video feeds today. Zorian, you want to talk about Metro?
Sure. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me?
You're a little faint.
Oh, okay. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. Hi. Hello, everyone. I won't go into too much detail about myself because they gave it in the beginning, but just some background on the school I work at. It's Metropolitan State University. It's a 4-year comprehensive university in downtown St. Paul. Around 11,500 students. We have a lot of transfers and part-time working students, so that's the numbers you kind of see below there. We have 9 librarians, 11 staff. Specifically with our e-resources, we have a moderately sized collection, I like to think. 218 database packages that were formerly managed in Serial Solutions. We had most of the Serial Solutions e-resource tools, 360 Core, 360 Link. We use it for e-journals. And we had the Summon Discovery service. So as you'll find out later, we were one of the few schools in our consortium that had that.
And at Normandale, we have a few more students than at Metro, but less librarians and less staff. And a similar number of e-resources packages, although somewhat less, 175 database packages. And we also had, also coming from 360 Core and 360 Link and eJournal Portal, we weren't using Intota, so we didn't have a full e-resources management system, but that's what we were using sort of in lieu of one. And we also used Discovery through Summon, which we've been using for over a decade. And then to give you a sense of the consortium and what we're made up of, we're actually quite diverse and large consortium because we include all of the Minnesota state colleges and universities, but also all of the state government libraries, and then a few of the private colleges and universities, and some of the special libraries as well, like the Historical Society. And in the migration to Alma and Primo, the consortium broke up into work groups, I think somewhat similarly to what the SUNY consortium has done. And so Zorian and I have worked both in the discovery work group and the electronic resources management work group. And we'll talk today about work we did specifically in the ERM work group in terms of making these recommendations. The work group, when we were thinking about what we want to contribute to the rest of the consortium was recommendations for activations in the community zone and in Primo Central, and recommendations for data testing and for configuring of electronic resources before and after go live, and just in general investigating and testing and making recommendations regarding any sort of electronic resources management functionality.
All right, so I'm going to talk about the open access packages side of this. So open access packages in Primo Central are an interesting beast to deal with. You'll see bright and green and prominently in the slide. I found as an e-resources librarian this very, very puzzling that Ex Libris activates all open access packages in the Primo Central Index for you. And it's kind of on you to, or the library or the consortium or whatever combination, to go in and opt out of any packages that you don't want to have. I find this, I think this is problematic because OA packages by nature are a can of worms. Obviously, you know, OA packages are various quality. They come in very different, they come in a lot of different languages, frankly. There's different formats, you know, in addition to just articles and ebooks, you can get digital collections and other things that come up that you would never believe. Packages are of different subjects. Some are, you know, interdisciplinary and some are very subject specific. And then as we'll get into later on, not everything that is turned on is actually turning on something. You don't actually get full text with it. Sometimes a lot of third-party sites present different options. So as I said, best practice calls for us being very selective with it. And in our very diverse consortium, it was definitely needed to have some kind of guidance from people who have more experience managing these things in discovery tools. Otherwise, it was going to get quite messy. So we tried to come up with some criterion for this. So for this recommendation that I ultimately authored for the consortium, I started with the Ex Libris spreadsheet for OA packages, which we have a link to at the end of the presentation, by the way. So I started with that spreadsheet and added 3 columns, an activate column, like yes, no, description, subject, and reason for non-activation. And some of the criterion we considered when we went through this list of 290, ultimately 290 packages was whether it actually provided full or partial access to open access content, what was the language, the primary language of the content, what was the nature of the content or format, and what was the subject. So in the activate column, we ultimately put one of 3 answers. One was yes, one was no, and one was optional. In this graph, you can see kind of the breakdown. For the vast majority of the packages that we looked at, we said no. We took a very conservative approach. A lot of those packages ended up being institutional repositories, often for like global or international universities. There was a lot of non-English journal content that we also turned off. Our consortium doesn't really have a lot of like a lot of graduate programs in foreign languages and stuff, so it wasn't applicable. And if it was, they can opt in. We gave that option. And then partial access collections, which have some OA content but are mostly not OA content, we were very conservative, just said no. Optional ones we left open to people to opt into because they were very subject specific. Maybe they had programs in physics or something that not everyone has, but maybe it would help to have OA packages for it. And then the 9 things we said yes to were open access textbooks, including the SUNY collection, and big publisher interdisciplinary collections like Wiley, Springer, Taylor and Francis, big journal collections that we know and trust pretty well to be thoroughly vetted content. We turned those on because they're multiple subjects. Most people could benefit from them, we thought. So here's a snippet of just a small section of the spreadsheet I filled out, and you can see in the highlighted column is the activate column, and the two columns to the right of it are the description and then the ultimate reason for deselection or non-activation. You can see that I think there's a JSTOR journals open access package there. JSTOR is a well-known platform, so we said yes. JSTOR is also multidisciplinary, so it could benefit everyone to have that on. Some of the optional ones you can see, someone may want to opt into Library of Congress collections that are digital images. We left it up to people to pick. This wasn't a policy, this is a recommendation. So it was, people ultimately could choose not to listen to us. And then at the bottom of the slide is a link to the full recommendation. And then a few other things to consider. One of the biggest things we found is some of the packages, OA packages, may be like, oh, really excited to turn on because, oh, HathiTrust, Project Gutenberg, this will be great, more content. But if you have small or even moderately sized local collections like your print holdings or even your subscribed content, turning these sort of things on will swamp. They will numerically outnumber your holdings. Like just in some certain, like there's hundreds of thousands or even millions of things in these things. So consider that. We found to consider that before turning them on. And we actually, I think, HathiTrust is both in OA content and all coverage. I think we ended up recommending HathiTrust not be turned on because it just flooded everything. Anything with ebook had a HathiTrust link and stuff. Another related point is you can boost the relevancy ranking of ALMA records, but you can't alter the relevancy ranking of OA records turned on the PCI. So what that means is if you turn it on in the community zone in ALMA, you can weigh that up and down, but you can't really push down things that you just turn on only in the PCI. So that's kind of you're kind of limited in how you can account for these big packages we found. We asked Ex Libris about that. So finally, two other scenarios. There's some packages that are in the OA list but still require an activation in the community zone for them to work because they require the community zone link resolver to work. And in the Primo Central wizard where you turn stuff on in the PCI, it'll show up in the description like you see in that snippet, the link via link resolver. Most of them are link and record, which means that you just turn it on and you don't have to worry about anything in ALMA. The other scenario is there is paradoxically, I think, OA collections that aren't in the Ex Libris' OA list. I don't know if it's because their list lags or just incomplete. But those titles can still be made available through like a subscription only activation in the PCI, but you also have to turn it on in the corresponding community zone package. So an example of that is Bentham journals, Bentham open access journals. In the PCI, you have to turn on the Bentham journals. And it looks like you're turning on a subscription only package that may provide access to stuff you don't have access to. But if you go into the community zone and only turn on the open access Bentham journals in the corresponding collection, that filters what you turned on the PCI to only the open access stuff. So there's other packages like that. So that's a way to kind of enhance your OA access.
So I'm going to switch gears here and oh, sorry. Okay. Zorian, I think there's an echo through your phone. Okay. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, there's still a little bit of an echo.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about alternative coverage. So Zorian talked about how to manage open access packages, and I'm going to talk about alternative coverage, which is coverage that we turn on to mitigate the issue of the lack of metadata sharing between vendors, principally data from EBSCO, that they refuse to share, and data from Gale that hasn't been indexed fully yet. And so those are the primary vendors that you're looking to provide alternative coverage for. And sort of related to that, the idea that at the consortium level, some activations in Primo Central can just be managed centrally. So I wanted to show this screenshot of what the Primo Central activation wizard now looks like. It just changed last week from the February update. They released a new interface. So if you've looked at the Primo Central activation screen before, it was not pretty. It was like a text-based page that didn't look anything like any of the other Alma interfaces. So this is what it looks like now. And up at the top, it's kind of easy to miss, but that gray stripe at the top gives you the option to inherit Consortium Central Office resources. And if it's checked, then you're going to be inheriting whatever the activations are from your consortium. And if you uncheck it, then you're no longer having those activations. So it's a pretty easy on-off switch. And then if you want to just see what your consortium has activated, you can click on that View All Resources Activated by the Consortium Central Office, and it will give you a screen that shows what has been activated. So that's an example screen on the right of what our consortium activated. And I'll talk you through sort of the process that we went through, both for alt coverage, but just also for activations that are reflective of the packages that we have access to because of consortium purchasing. So as a group, as the Electronic Resources Management Work Group, we decided that we wanted the consortium to handle any Primo Central activations that were for collections that were available to all member libraries. And especially those, we have really specific and limited consortium-wide purchasing, so it's those collections that are really relevant for all of us too. So we use the list of packages that we all have access to and said those should all be handled at the consortium level, primarily because we were thinking, even though Zorian and I come from fairly large institutions, thinking about those of us that were at smaller libraries, that if we can take as much as we can take off the plates of librarians at smaller institutions, that we should do that. So that way they don't have to worry about it. And that we also wanted the alt coverage activations that happen at the consortium level to be pretty conservative, because we wanted to have a situation where most of the libraries were going to opt in to getting those activations from the consortium level, rather than opting out because they didn't like one or two of the packages, didn't want those activated. So we thought it would be better that everyone opt in, and that if they wanted to add additional alt coverage, that they could do that at the institution level. In terms of guidelines for individual libraries, as a work group, we gave the following guidelines to our libraries, that we did not recommend activating open access collections solely for alternative coverage purposes for the same reasons that Zorian's been talking about. So HathiTrust does appear on the on the alt coverage list, but there might be reasons that you don't want to activate that because you don't want those records to swamp what you already have, and so on. So unless you were activating HathiTrust for another reason, we didn't recommend use it for alternative coverage. And to not activate any of the collections that are classified as search rights by subscription, unless you have a subscription, because it's just not going to work. You need a subscription in order to use that for alt coverage. And then to only selectively activate Crossref collections to avoid duplicate records. If you were to select the one listing that's activating all Crossref collections, and you already have other publisher packages activated in Primo Central, it will create duplicate records where there are duplications. So if you have Wiley selected already, and then you activate all Crossref collections, including then Wiley, you'll get duplicate records for Wiley, for example. Now, Ex Libris provides this alt coverage spreadsheet that you may have seen, and gives an index coverage percentage of their guess or estimate of how much of the collection is covered through this alt coverage process. But I don't really think they're true percentages, in the sense that it's unlikely that most libraries would actually activate all of those packages. So while they're theoretically the index coverage percentage, I don't think they're the real world index coverage percentage. For example, there's packages on there, some of them that I've highlighted, like the National Diet Library of Japan. Those are records that are only in Japanese. The listings that have an asterisk next to them, like Scopus and OA Finder, you need a subscription in order to access. So if you have that subscription already in your institution, then that does provide alt coverage. But if you don't have that subscription, you're not getting that alt coverage. And there may be others that you choose for one reason or another not to activate. We did not have time in our work group to do the overlap analysis that would have give an answer to what the actual index coverage is. But I would say it's likely far less than what is listed on the spreadsheet. I thought you guys would want to know some examples of things that we chose not to activate that were on the alt coverage spreadsheet from Ex Libris, but that we decided not to. One of the ones I already mentioned was that all Crossref collections listing. Not that you don't want to use Crossref, but that doing it in that wholesale manner would create a lot of duplicate records for some of our libraries that already had other packages. So we advise libraries to activate Crossref on their own and didn't provide it as part of the consortial level activations. And then another library that I did also already mention was that library in Japan, records not available in English. So situations where that was happening on the list, we also didn't activate. We didn't activate HathiTrust, and we left it to the libraries to do so. And then there were some other packages that we just weren't familiar with, and didn't want to activate now, and rather would want more time to test in the sandbox and see what those records were like. And so we decided not to activate them at the consortial level. And these were records from Sweden and from Germany that we weren't familiar with how those records show up and how useful they are. And then the one group of collections that we also didn't activate that we didn't know to think about before we got into this process was there are collections listed on that alt coverage spreadsheet that are listed as subscription collection level full text linking. And those we didn't want to activate because unless you subscribe to them through your licenses, you're not going to get the user experience that you want. The point of alt coverage is to provide metadata for the packages that we do subscribe to when the metadata isn't there, and to fill in that gap. But with those collections that are only on the collection level linking, they don't use the link resolver, so they're not being limited by our holdings. And so they're showing your user everything in the collection, even stuff that your user doesn't have access to. And I know that might not quite make sense, so we might talk about it more in the questions. But that was one area that we didn't know about and isn't in any of the documentation, and we just had a lot of conversations with the Ex Libris implementation staff to get to this distinction. Here's my slide of unrelated miscellaneous tips. The set it and forget it redirect server. We wanted a way to manage the outbound open URL links that happen at the vendor site. For example, in the references of a particular article where there's links in each of those citations to your open URL server. Those have to be set on each vendor site. And we were concerned about the go live date, getting all of those switched over at the vendor sites all at the same time and would be difficult, and there would be a lag time for some vendors that don't allow us to do that updating ourselves, and then our users would be being directed the wrong way. So we set up a redirect server and changed those links ahead of time, and then just had to change it in the server settings where that link was directing. That gives us more time to go back to the vendor and set the permanent linking structure. It was also a good time to go through, like, do these links actually work? Are they useful on the vendor site? The other thing is, if you have access to the Basecamp for the project, to really take advantage of having that access. Some of those conversations that we had with ex-Libris staff in Basecamp were much more productive than any of the trainings, and we got a lot farther in terms of figuring things out the way that we needed to. Also, I don't think I knew that there was going to be such a tiny window between when you've gotten access to your cutover data, you've accepted that data, and then you go live. There's just a few days where you've accepted your data and then you go live. And so there's a ton of things that can only be done after you've accepted your data to set up things like the link parameter customizations, things that are specific to individual packages but need to be set up in order for the actual delivery of content to work. And it would have been helpful if I'd had a full list of what all of those things are. And then the more we can do real queries when testing Primo V, then the more you can actually find problems that are going to occur for your users. And I think the one way we can reach out to some reference librarians who may not be as involved with the migration is to say, give us a list of, like, what are your actual queries? What are your strings that you've used on the reference desk? What articles did you end up finding and using? And can I find those in Primo? You can do a lot of that testing early on to identify some of the problems. And then I think we just have time for questions, and that's our contact information, our emails, if you have questions for us later. And also, like Zorian said, the link to the ex-Libris spreadsheets for alt coverage and open access.
All right, well, thank you guys. We have like 2 minutes for questions. We have a couple questions in the chat. If we don't get to your question again, please email our presenters and they will be more than happy to answer your questions. Michelle wanted to know if you've had issues with results from predatory publishers creeping into results because of turning on open access content.
I think because we've been so conservative with what open access content we've set up, that currently I haven't noticed that.
Yeah, I think one thing we did not point out is we just went live on Tuesday.
Well, some of our libraries were closed on Tuesday because of the weather, so we went live at Normandale yesterday.
Oh
wow.
Yeah, we're supposed to go live like a couple of days before this presentation. So, but yeah, as far as so far, I don't think anyone has reported any predatory stuff. But I think like Lacey said, I think this approach, part of when I said in the beginning, like OA is a can of worms, the best practice is not turning it on because you're just inviting that if you turn everything on and don't look at it. So I think this whole approach was aimed at preventing that from happening. And it seems to have worked so far, 4 days in or 2 days in.
All right, and we have 2 more questions in the chat. We have time for one of them. So I'm gonna go with Wendy's question. Why did you choose to provide access to the EBSCO versus via alt coverage versus using the EBSCO API?
Because the EBSCO API has so many problems with it. The EBSCO API assumes phrase searching by default, which leads to a lot of zero results queries because no one's expecting phrase searching without them using quotation marks. And because if there's one database that's set up wrong, then the whole search doesn't work. And just because of knowing our users, teaching them to use one particular search box in order to get to a particular vendor was just not going to work for us. I think philosophically we didn't agree that users should have to know what vendor they're getting information from.